right, so the basket's empty, so we'll either have text questions or questions from the floor. And let's start with the questions from the floor. Anybody? Or shall I start us off? I have a question ready for you.
Okay, that's great.
So I noticed a couple of times you were talking about, you know, how Christianity is different from other religions. How Christianity doesn't rely on, you know, our good deeds, that kind of thing. You said almost all other religions. Were you just being careful? Or
Just being careful.
Okay.
I wasn't thinking of anyone in particular. And I'm not an expert on all the world religions, and so I was just qualifying that.
It's the academic in you not wanting to
Yes,
overstate.
yes. There wasn't any particular religion I was thinking of when I was saying that. So good catch.
Yeah, I'll say that whenever you talked about the good things that we can see in other religions, you mentioned Mormonism, and I've spent a long time dialoguing with Mormon missionaries.
Oh yeah, me too.
And one thing that I always think about whenever I meet Mormons is, man, they do such a good job in raising their youth. Because you look at your average evangelical church, and I mean, you know, sometimes the kids just don't turn out all that great. But you know, these young men, they seem like they're just so put together.
Yeah.
Now, of course, inside there might be something else going on. You know, there's definitely a facade, I guess you could say, but you know, there's some credit to give them there. So, all right, well, what about you guys? What kind of questions do you have?
I have a question. Dr. Mullen, you were talking about, of course, the Christian attitude toward other belief systems. But what if those belief systems are essentially antagonistic toward Christianity? For example, Islam. You can, if you're a really committed Muslim, you want Sharia law to be supreme. And that would come into conflict, I think, with not only being in the United States, but perhaps maybe even looking at Christians, because I just finished reading a book. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of Raymond Ibrahim. He's a scholar, but he wrote a book called Sword and Scimitar. He's talked about the relationship between Christianity and Islam over the years, and I've read other books like that in the past. And I'm not sure if you're aware of Badia, or she's French, but she's Israeli trained, and has written a bunch of books about the Dini and Dinitude and all of this. And so if you have that kind of a system, especially if you're thinking about that being in the United States, you're talking, of course, about political, and I'm not sure how you want to go with this, but the point is, I guess, how would you deal with that when a religious belief system really is antagonistic toward your belief system?
So you want me to handle the political?
No, just about,
So
how would you,
So I
how
would
would
still
you reach,
say,
right?
so I would say a couple things. So I still think that the inclination that Muslim people have towards towards God, is because of the divine image in God that has now fallen and manifests itself in that particular form of idolatry. I think that as a nation, and I'm going to give a very Baptist answer here, we must consistently oppose any type of religious beliefs that would not allow latitude and freedom for other religious beliefs, because that's compulsion, and that the state has no right to do that. So, and I think that as a country, as the United States, I think that it is a good thing that we also advocate that across the world, because that allows the most opportunity for human beings to be free and to flourish at the most fundamental and most important thing in life, because of the image of God and religious practice. So that's probably like half an answer, I think.
No,
Okay.
But I think, you know, in some cases, and this is something that, again, I think many people might have a question about, because of what's happening recently, and what happened on 9/11,
absolutely.
and you know that if there is a belief system like that, that really is in many ways inimical to Christianity, then how would you? And you know, if you convert Muslims in the United States and they go back to a very closed Islamic country, they're not going to be able to openly express that. If they
No, they have to be
killed.
very careful, actually.
Yeah. So I mean, this is not. It's like you know, I had a Jewish roommate in college, and he was not expressly religious, but he was a Jew. And so
Right.
he was very defensive of being Jewish. And to convert him, and I talked to him about the gospel all the
Yeah.
time, but for him, that would be a betrayal of his whole
His
family,
family
his
and his
ancestry.
identity.
Right, so
yeah.
that's a big issue,
Yeah.
that I think we have to also acknowledge that would be very difficult for those people to do. But again, if there's some, you know, inimical, if they really want to, you know, let's put it this way, in this book, he talks about how the objective in many of these cases, and starting the Battle of Yarmouk in 636 and going all the way to 1683, the last time that Muslims tried to conquer Europe, their objective was to really destroy Christianity. Now, that may not be every Muslim, but if they're very committed and they really do believe that this is the strategy, can you see how that might be a problem?
Sure, and I think
People wanting to reach or have them enter the United States in large numbers.
Sure, I do see that. I mean, I do understand the concerns about that as well. And I do think that there is like just in the Revolutionary War, there was a time to take up arms in defense of freedoms. I'm not opposed to that at all. So I think it's sometimes difficult to know where that line is and that kind of thing. So,
I just thought that was so.
yeah, absolutely. Other questions?
If someone were to ask you, is radical Islam any different than radical Christianity? Because there are some who draw that as being equivalent.
I want to know what they meant by, I think we know what radical Islam is, you know, what is radical Christianity? What does that mean? Because David Platt wrote a book called Radical, and that's kind of a good radical Christianity, but there are probably forms of, so.
Maybe like Westboro Baptist, is that kind of what you're thinking of, maybe?
And that's where I think you run into a problem, saying that they are equivalents, they are not equivalents. True followers of Jesus Christ and his teaching are the least dangerous people on the face of the earth. Those who truly follow, and if you really read the teachings of Islam, they are extremely dangerous. It's true that most Muslims aren't that dangerous, because the reality is they're nominal Muslims. They're Muslim in name only. They do not follow the teachings of Islam. If they did, they would be killing us. Of course, we have to throw in the very important concept, and I'm not sure if I pronounced it right, Qaeda, that's used very often in Islam. It's the concept of using deception. You deceive others until you get in a position where you are the majority, and then you turn things around. And that is the way Islam is taught.
So what's the question?
I don't know. but it's a question that people will bring to you. Well, really, there's no difference between radical Christianity and radical Islam, and it couldn't be any further from the truth. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is that we need to be ready with an answer when people make those points and ask those type of questions, so we know the difference.
Yeah, and I think I want to know, like I would always, that's what I would do. What do you mean by radical Christianity? Oh, well, I mean like people who are, you know, doing X, Y, or Z. You say, well, I mean, then you have to kind of unpack that term. I think we know what it's been painted as radical Islam, and everybody, most people would recognize that that's problematic, at least in our country. So, and I think as Christians, I think we are, as American Christians, we do operate in kind of two kingdoms. We have a kingdom of Christ, and then the kingdom under which we are. And I think America has been generally a force for good in the world, and with promotion, especially since, especially in the beginning of the 20th century, World War II, that kind of thing, promotion of religious freedom, or at least religious tolerance, even in some other countries, and religious freedom, and that's a good thing. And I think it's okay for us as Christians to advocate for that, because that's consistent with our beliefs, particularly as Baptists. And I mean, you see this. I mean, it's particularly the kind of oppression and radicalness you're talking about is especially pungent right now in some Islamic areas, right? But you have seen this in some areas that claim to be Christian over the years as well, and that's particularly troubling. I think we need to own that and say, like, this was a bad thing, like when Christians killed Christians in the name of religion, and then say, but we're in a better place now in the West, or at least for now, with religious freedom, and we believe that other people should have that choice too. That's kind of a wandering answer, but
Another one of the questions.
Well, I would also say that what you're saying is typically used when people are talking about crusades, or they're talking about, like I've been teaching recently in my upper level class on Middle Ages, Charlemagne. Charlemagne was a great king in the Middle Ages, and he believed in evangelism by the sword. He tried to convert the Saxons and did, but you have to understand, and I always tell the students, they have to understand the context of that he believed he was a religious propagator of the faith. That was part of his responsibility as a king. And so these people were pagan, idolatrous, devils, being influenced by demons, and so they needed to be treated the way they were treated. Doesn't excuse it, but it's sort of the context. Whereas I think there's a difference there between his actions that he was misguided in that type of technique, and some pretty well documented expressions of what jihad is. That many conservative Muslim scholars, there are two concepts of jihad. One's inner struggle, the other is basically conflict to spread the faith. And that interpretation has been largely adopted by conservative Muslim scholars. So they're not wrong in what they're saying. They're just interpreting that part of jihad as being the proper mode, not the internal struggle part. And that's the problem. People do believe that. And again, so the reason I brought this up is I think it's a concern that many of us have, or we at least see expressed in our country, as to why you would want to limit, with Trump's ban on some certain countries coming in, people coming in. If people really do believe that Sharia law should be supreme, then that means that that's going to be to the exclusion of other law that is already existing in this country. So that's something that is a problem. And you can see some places where there's becoming even a higher Muslim population, like Minneapolis, for example, people from Somalia. And it really can have political implications as well. Badia Orr, the lady that I talked about, the scholar who has written a number of books, she wrote a book called Eurabia. And this was how Islam has really made inroads in Europe, to where she claims, makes the point and argues very well, that Western Europe is essentially the land of the dini. The dini means if you're not a Muslim, you're allowed to be there, but you are a second-class citizen, you have to pay a tax called the jizya, and you were not allowed certain rights and privileges, but you were allowed to live. So she claims that Europe has become almost the land of the dini, so that's why she calls it Arabia. So it's not necessarily something that will happen outright, but perhaps over time, and I think that's what many people fear. I don't want to be just a propagator of fear-mongering, but many Americans, I think, are thinking that could happen. So that's why I asked the question.
I'll throw something in here, just kind of maybe moving from the political to the personal. Some thoughts that I had as we're talking about this is, a lot of times you'll have people say to Christians, they'll say, oh, I would never be a Christian because, and they might point to the Crusades, or maybe they'll even point to someone who was mean to them, here in the present time. Oh, Christians act this way, they're hypocrites, or whatever. And then the question to ask is, okay, well, when Christians do this, or whatever they've done in the past, is that consistent or inconsistent with the teachings of Christ? And it's inconsistent with the teachings of Christ. And with Islam, we might say that's kind of flip-flop, right? So yeah, if you read the Quran, you see some really troubling things there. But it's also true that there are some Muslims that do not really follow those things in the Quran. They might be more or less culturally Muslim. And so we distinguish between the person and the actual religion. And so sometimes that can be tricky, but I think that's something that we have to keep in mind.
I wanted to pick up on something you said kind of tangentially. You talked, there is a point at which, and I do believe the religious inclination comes because of the image of God, and that our hearts are restless, and that we're pushed towards something greater than ourselves, and that we're going to fill that with something. But there is a point at which that can become demonic too. Like, and I don't want to downplay that. I think I've known Christians who, like, everything's demonic. Mormons try to be good, they're demonic. I'm not sure, that's the case, but there are religious practices that are clearly demonic, and we need to recognize that as well. And takes us into a little different thing, where that religious impulse pushes a person, or a person is drawn to, or they choose, or whatever, however you want to think of it, something really, truly, in and of itself, evil and wicked, in a different way.
Yes.
I've known some folks who claim to be Christians, and I believe they are saved believers, but they hold the belief that there is more than one way to heaven, like specifically, through Islam, and all the hymns, you go to heaven that way, or other religions. Can you truly be a saved person and hold those beliefs?
I'll repeat that so everybody can hear. The question was, she said that she knows people who seem to be genuine Christians, but they believe that other religions, that if people follow other religions, that they can get to heaven that way. And so the question is, can a person truly be a Christian and yet believe that there's more than one way to heaven?
It's like a pastoral question. So it is not true. I don't believe that it is true that people can actually get to heaven in another way. Sometimes, I hope I'm wrong about that, right? Like, I think I'm convinced that I'm right about that. I'm convinced that's what the scripture teaches. I'm convinced that's what Paul is talking about in Acts 17. But sometimes you just don't, maybe you're wrong, that there's some, just because you don't want people to face eternal torment. I do think it's inconsistent with the exclusivity of the gospel, and the necessity of what we see in the New Testament to believe that. Now, can someone have a wrong belief and still be born again? I think the answer to that is yes. This one touches on, it touches on the core of the gospel a little bit, though, so that leaves that open to question. C.S. Lewis believed that, right? Like, I'm pretty hopeful that he's truly was born again and that I'll see him again, but I won't know till I get there. So it's kind of a squishy thing in that regard. So I want to answer that a different way here.
No, I think that what Dr. Mullen is saying is right, that it's wrong and it's dangerous, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the person's not saved. Ultimately, only God's going to know. And he's also right saying that it does kind of really touch at the core of the gospel. So that's why I say it's dangerous, is kind of getting to that point to where we say, okay, I'm not going to be the judge of where you are. You're saying you're trusting in Jesus for the forgiveness of your sins, but this is really, really troubling. And people will express that kind of pluralism in different ways. I don't know if who you're speaking of would say this, but sometimes they'll say that even though they believe in other religions, that they're still saved through Jesus. That Jesus is still the one who's forgiving their sins, but they're accomplishing it through some other means. Or maybe something kind of in the middle of that is people say, okay, well, what if somebody who really has no specific religion, but just they've never heard the gospel? Those who have never heard the gospel, do they have some kind of special exception? And I think Romans 1 speaks to that. He says that everyone knows enough about God through creation that they are without excuse. Even though they don't know the gospel, God's general revelation is enough to condemn us. And so we want to bring to them God's special revelation, that is the gospel of Jesus Christ, because that is the only hope for salvation. So again, that comes back to, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. And that is through explicit faith in him. So I think that's clear and that's important. But the question is, can a person be a Christian and believe otherwise? And I wouldn't exclude that, but I would say that it's a dangerous position to have.
I know you didn't talk about what other religions they lost?
Yes. It's been a long time since I've studied the specificity of Jehovah's Witnesses, so if one of you guys has done that recently, that'd be helpful to step in here.
Well, I would just say that historically, what has been considered heresy, that is something that will condemn a person, is things that really touch at the person of Christ, Christological errors. So when it comes to Jehovah's Witnesses, when it comes to Mormons, the big issue there is the deity of Christ. Is Jesus divine? Is he God? And because they answer that question no, that would put them in the realm of not true Christian. So I would agree with Dr. Moore on that.
And it really gets to the point, like, I mean, the question is, do you need God to save you, or can you do it on your own? Right? Was Jesus just a good man who was really, really good and then became divine in some way? Or was he God because we need God to save us? And the Christian answer is, yeah, it's so bad we need God to save us. And thank God he has done this. So.
And the thing is, with both Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses, even though this issue of the deity of Christ is really at the core of their error, there are all kinds of other things that kind of pile on top of that. And I think that it's kind of part and parcel to this error. But it's a moralism, especially. I know more about Mormonism than I do about Jehovah's Witnesses, but it is kind of a works-oriented salvation. But there's also just so many other things about the nature of God and who Jesus is. I know that Mormons teach that not only is Jesus not divine, but that he was created, that God himself has a body, is a physical being, and that there were gods before him, and that we can one day be gods. I mean, when you get into it, it becomes so bizarre. You can see, okay, even though they might try to market this as Christianity, it is very, very different from Orthodox Christianity. That's true of both Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yeah, it's precisely the heresy that was addressed at the Council of Nicaea. Very famous church council condemned Arianism, which is basically what they believe.
And here's something really interesting. Just the past couple of evenings, we've talked about the power of entertainment, the power of music, and how it can deceive people. Well, Arius, who's teaching this heresy that Jesus was not divine, he taught it through a jingle. There was a time when God was not, or there was
There was a time when he was not.
There was a time when he was not. Yeah. And so yeah, it was this jingle that kind of caught on, and that was the way it was disseminated. And so there are new heresies for every age, and or whether or not you call them heresies, false teachings, dangerous teachings. And so of course we have those in our culture that can come through various means. What else? Any other questions?
Just to follow up on that. So when I talk with these individuals, the thing that I need to know is where they're here.
So how do they think they're saved?
So I think they're saved because.
How? How are they saved? What's the mechanism? In what way?
Yeah, that's.
Like, I think that's where most of the breakdown is going to come between most groups in Christianity, Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, even some offshoots of Protestantism. Are they saved because they're good enough, and are they saved through a God who has stepped down into this world and redeemed us? Not just paying for our sins, but redeeming the whole body, the whole human existence. I think that's where the rub comes. I mean, I think they're going to tell you that they do good works, right? And that's where we have, your pastor, we had some Mormon missionaries that kept coming to the house, and I was like, y'all keep coming, we'll keep talking. And they wouldn't, like, they're getting savvy now. Like, I'm like, well, what about grace? Oh, we believe in grace. And they constantly would talk. So how do you mean grace? And they're like, well, blah, blah, blah. And then finally, it was raining one day, and so the guys had to get a ride with somebody who was what do they call? They call them deacons at the elders. Well, one of the guys at the local church, the missionaries, And I said, well, we were talking about grace last time. And then he was like, yeah, well, we know it's mostly grace, but we have to do a little bit, right? And the missionaries were like, and they never came back after that, right?
The Book of Mormon says, it is by grace you are saved after all you can do.
Yeah.
Um,
So, but they were, so I think that's the key. And I think that is actually a danger in cultural Christianity. People who grow up in the church or have, grow up, there is a danger that they think that it's by their works or by their goodness or by church things that they are saved. And sometimes those are the hardest people to convey the gospel to. So I think that even permeates. I think it's just a natural inclination. It's pride. We want to be able to do something good enough for God to accept us. And Christian teaching is that is absolutely impossible. That we can never do anything good enough for God to accept us, but that He has done it for us in the most beautiful and wonderful and fantastic way.
Chad, I want to go back to what Lisa was talking about. I was just thinking that maybe, a Christian might say something like that or believe something like that, because the worst sin we can commit in our culture today is intolerance. And if we're seen as not being tolerant, then we're, it's the worst thing, So we've got to be tolerant and, kind of say, well, yeah, there may be other ways to heaven, because we don't want to be seen, like we're just bigoted and intolerant of others. I'm just guessing.
Yeah, I think that tolerance has to do with it, but also there's just that impulse that we don't want people to go to hell,
Right.
Hopefully.
Yeah,
Hopefully
but
we have that
I would
impulse.
say one thing that we have to remember is the depth of our sin, and I think that sometimes people can kind of slip into that pluralism because they forget that we really do deserve hell. And so it almost seems as if God's unjust to send somebody to hell, somebody of a different religion. And so if you think God is unjust to send them to hell, it's because you're not recognizing the sinfulness of man, and you're not recognizing the holiness of God either. And when you recognize both of those, you see how big that gap is, and you can still have a heart of compassion for them, and you want them to be saved, but not because they deserve it, not because it would be unjust for God to give them their just punishment, but because God saved me, and I want that others to experience that grace. So I think that's kind of something that we have to remember. One last question. Let me see if any have come in with a text message.
Probably 10 and I forgot.
My computer went to sleep, so I gotta don't look at my password.
I love Emily. That's so easy, Pastor.
The wheels turning there. Okay, no, we don't have any new ones. So, any last questions from the floor? Yeah.
When you're talking to someone of another religion, how much emphasis should we put on our own understanding of their religion when we're dialoguing with them? Like, if we're talking with Mormons, should we really study the Book of Mormon so that we can know what is it they are really being taught, so that we know the difference between, or should we just rely on how much we know of our own religion with that?
I'll say something real quick, because what I did with some Mormon missionaries, they came and we had a long talk, and then afterwards I remembered a book. I hadn't read the book yet, but I'd heard about it. It's by Craig Blomberg and I'm John Blank now.
Mormon guy.
Yeah.
How great the divide.
Yeah, how wide the divide. Yeah. So Craig Blomberg, and then there's a Mormon author, I can't remember his name, but it's co-authored between them, and they just go back and forth on their beliefs and the differences between evangelical Christianity and Mormonism on these key issues of God and Jesus and salvation, things like that. And I thought, okay, well, if I just have them come back and I say I'm going to preach the gospel to you, well, eventually they're going to stop coming, and they're going to be instructed to stop coming if they just themselves don't, right? Because they don't want their missionaries to be evangelizing. Their missionaries are supposed to be evangelizing them. And so, so I thought, okay, well, if we just go through this book together, we can kind of banter the guys. I want to learn more about Mormonism, and maybe you can learn about my perspective. And so for 8 weeks, we went through chapter by chapter this book, and I learned a lot about Mormonism through it. But I was able to bring out, of course, the book brought these things out as well, just bring out these differences and say, okay, so here's a key difference. Mormonism teaches this about grace, but this is what I believe, and this is where I see it in the Bible, and this is why I think Mormons claim to believe the Bible as well, right? Of course, they have the Book of Mormon and the Pearl of Great Price and these other works. But if by doing that, by learning about Mormonism, you can actually show those differences and maybe have a better audience with them.
I had a Mormon friend that we were going to read that book together, and he disappeared.
Stephen Robinson, that's
it. I bought 2 copies, and then he's like, so, I think some people are called to that ministry to really know others, those groups. I mean, I think though that I think it's really important for us to know our own faith, and I don't think we do a really good job of that sometimes. And so I think that's the first start. Kind of like the counter-offender study is a real thing. Were you going to say that?
Yeah.
We're on the same. So I always feel good when I'm on the same page with Dr. Swisher. So I will say too, sometimes people that are called to that ministry, like anti-cult ministry, or they used to call it, they have to be careful to maintain a attitude of Christian love, which is hard sometimes. So they can be really combative, and I don't think that ever wins anybody to Christ. I mean, I don't really see that. Even Jesus being combative with the Pharisees, there's no indication that any of the Pharisees that he was combative with. I think right about this ever came to know Christ. So, am I wrong about that? I'm just thinking about that right now. Don't write that down, because I'm sure about that.
I would just say too that I think that the more you know, the better. I mean, I wouldn't rely on what I've heard about Mormonism. I think it's better to know as much as possible if you're so inclined to do that, and especially if you know people that are Mormons that you do come in contact with regularly. Or you can read some good books about it, or it used to be in Nauvoo, which we need to go to some point. At Nauvoo, they used to have a Christian visitor center, and the people that ran the center, the man who was the one who ran the center, was a 5th generation Mormon, so he knew, all that he needed to know about Mormonism, and you could talk to him and ask him questions. And so that would be what I would suggest, as much as you can. Don't just rely on what you've heard, because that would get you into trouble, I think. And also, I think if you're talking about Islam, one of the things that I like about Rahman Ibrahim's book is that he's actually an Arabic speaker, so he knows to translate, because oftentimes what will happen, what you were talking about, is you'll hear a translation of what they're saying, but it's not really what they're saying. I don't know if you've ever had that experience. I had, in college, I had German and some other languages, and so I'm watching these movies, and they'll say, in a movie, they'll have a subtitle, and I'll say, well, that's not what he said. I'm not an expert, but again, I know enough to say, well, that's not really what he said. So I think it's also good to rely on people that know what they're talking about in that area as well, so that you don't get false information that you would transmit and not be accurate.
And it's good not to only know the nuts and bolts of the religion, but also to know what is it that really makes them tick. So I read a book on Mormonism just called "I Love Mormons," and one of the one of the major points in it is that I can't remember exactly how it was worded, but basically they're a heart people. They're very emotionally oriented. So like when a Mormon missionary comes to your house, they'll say, read the Book of Mormon, and God will testify to you in your spirit that it's true. So that's the kind of thing that they rely upon. And so, my tendency is to say, all right, well, I just want to do some logic chopping with you and show you all these errors. And so when I go back and look at my interaction with those Mormons, that's kind of one of the things I think, okay, well, that's something I would do a little bit differently. I would maybe kind of speak to them more on a heart level, because that's what makes them tick. And yeah, so I was going to say something else, but it escaped me. But yeah, just know what it is that makes them tick, and speak to them on that level as well. Oh, I was going to say, I can't remember which speaker it was, but one of our speakers in the Q&A said something about how logic doesn't work with a lot of people. And that's really unfortunate, because I think that we have that on our side as Christians, right? Because it's true, but that just doesn't resonate with people sometimes. And so, of course, we don't want to back away from that. We want to proclaim the truth to them, but we also have to recognize that there are other ways that we're going to have to reach them. All right, so I think that will conclude our Q&A time. Thank you very much.
Thanks for inviting me.
It was wonderful.